Chapter 1. Victor completely ignored everyone else as he sprinted out the door. Stephanie regained her breath and smiled as she watched Victor run to meet the woman he loved. The others rushed after him. Lizard teleported up next to him and helped knock super soldiers out of the way as they rushed to attack Victor. Sig was surprised how many fewer super soldiers there were than when he had first stormed into the compound. The three-faced guards that attacked them were formidable, but not like the swarming numbers of them that had hindered them on the way in. A combination of a pistol and a golden shield proved to be quite effective, especially when Lizard used his speed to disorient their enemies. Before long, they arrived at the transit station. Even with Victor's intense speed, the others had been able to catch up. They hopped onto one of the transit trains, but the power on board suddenly shut down. "They're trying to stop us," said Lucas. "Can you get us going again?" asked Victor. "I think so," said Lucas as he nodded. A few commands into a nearby computer terminal brought the lights back on, and they hopped inside. A few moments later, they sped through the tunnels heading north. Victor paced back and forth impatiently. Old torn signs flapped as the vehicle rushed by. The flickering fluorescent lights appeared semi-periodically as they passed vacant platforms. The train had not been well maintained, and the cars rattled as they flew along the rails. "I don't want to be late," said Victor impatiently. Typically, it had been Jennifer who suffered from the sense that she was late for something important. Stephanie put her hand on his shoulder and smiled sympathetically, as if she were saying that they would make it in time. Within minutes, the train screeched to a halt. They rushed outside. "Where is she?" asked Victor. Stephanie pointed into the west. Victor began running without bothering to ask how far away she was. Lizard muttered something under his breath and teleported away. A few moments later, he reappeared with a look of worry on his face. "She's unconscious," said Lizard. "She was still breathing, but just barely." "How far?" asked Victor as he gasped for air. "The crater is a few hundred yards away," replied Lizard, "and there's something else you should know." "What?" asked Victor. "There's some kind of demon worshipper gathering in the hills beyond," he said. Victor clenched his fists as if to will his body to move faster. Of course, it did not improve his speed, but he was able to ignore the mounting exhaustion in his body as he rushed ahead. Gravity helped pull Victor toward Jennifer as he sprinted down the side of the crater. It was not long before the group had made it to her. Victor gasped for air as he pulled out his key and placed a hand on Jennifer's head. "She's lost a lot of blood," whispered Row 82 as he looked at the blood-tinted dirt and debris underneath her. Victor pretended not to hear, but he knew that the augment was right. "We've got company," said Lucas as he pointed to the far hills. Hordes of demon worshippers in big cloaks swarmed down the hill. "I can handle this," said Kirana confidently. Her eyes began glowing as she took the chain that held her mirrored key off of her neck. It morphed into a massive flaming katana and brought a warm orange light to her pale face and a sheen to her straight dark hair. Her long white cloak flowed behind her as she rushed to meet the swarms of demon worshippers. All at once they began breathing fire toward her. Seeing a group of fire demons made her sword flare up brighter as she swung through the closest of them. It was not long before the bodies began piling up, forcing Kirana back. She was surprised by how suicidal their offensive seemed. They were not even getting close to her, and she was cutting them down as fast as they rushed toward her. After a few moments, she saw something that made more sense. The bodies she had cut apart began pulling back together. The demon worshippers she had killed were coming back to life. "What is this?" she whispered. Jonathan rushed out beside her and helped slice through the advancing swarm of demon worshippers. "They are raising the dead," said Jonathan. "How is that even possible?" asked Kirana. "Catherine Page," shouted Lucas from within the shield. They turned and saw him pointing at a green-cloaked figure on a hilltop with a skull mask. Kirana began rushing toward her, but the demon worshippers swarmed her. Even though she cut through hundreds with every passing moment, the necromancer raised them again. Kirana was already tired from the rushed trip to find Jennifer, and the constant spinning and slicing began to wear on her. Several fire demon worshippers in red cloaks rushed up toward her and prepared to shoot fire at her as if they were anticipating her movements. They did not anticipate Jonathan and Stephanie slashing and shooting through them, though. "The demon prophetess is here," said Jonathan with glowing eyes. He was reading Stephanie's mind to help predict the movements of the enemy. With fluid motion, they slashed and spun through the swarms of enemies. "Fireball incoming!" shouted Jonathan. Kirana leapt up into the air and deflected the huge projectile into a clump of demon worshippers. They screamed as their flesh burned away, but they did not die. They continued pressing their attack as they charged toward Kirana, Jonathan, and Stephanie. As Kirana landed, she caught a glimpse of a man in a red and black cloak. "David Sawyer," she said angrily. "And Felix Light," said Jonathan, pointing to their old enemy. Dozens of demon worshippers began rushing at tremendous speeds, but Lizard was able to teleport between them and press them back. "I've never seen them all together," said Kirana as she swung her burning blade. "Me neither," said Jonathan as he slashed through a pair of charred skeleton attackers. Kirana slashed through another huge group, but the dead bodies underneath them leapt up to strike. "Jump back!" shouted Jonathan as he and Stephanie retreated a bit. Kirana spun again before retreating, narrowly missing another large fiery projectile from David Sawyer. Lizard teleported in briefly to speak to Jonathan. "Did they know we were here?" asked Lizard with air quotes. "I don't know," said Jonathan. Lizard teleported away to press back the speeding swarms from Felix Light's ranks. "But they are anticipating our movements," said Kirana as she watched a group of demon worshippers duck underneath her slashing attack. "Yes," said Jonathan. "The demon prophetess is helping them." "What do we do about it?" asked Kirana. Jonathan turned to Stephanie. "What do you think, Stephanie?" he asked. After a moment, he furrowed his brow. "Stay close to the shield?" asked Jonathan. "Why?" "Actually, I think it is a good idea for you to stay close to the shield," said Kirana. "Kirana, you know I can help," said Jonathan in a disappointed tone. "Don't whine about it, Jonathan," said Kirana angrily. "If things get dicey, you can get under Sig's shield." "You too, then," said Jonathan. Kirana scowled. "Fine," she muttered. They fought their way closer to the shield. Bodies of demon worshippers stacked up in heaps and then leapt toward them in pressing throngs. The three of them were breathing heavily as the battle drew on. "Your friends are getting tired," said Felix with a smile. "But you know that I don't get tired," replied Lizard with a grin. "You know that even if you defeat me, I will come back," taunted Felix. "You mean your necromancer can help you," said Lizard. He teleported next to the green-robed woman with the skull mask. To his shock, the demon prophetess was waiting for him and stuck a knife into his leg. He shrieked in pain as he teleported away. "That was the right objective, Lizard," said Felix, "but you have no idea how well our defenses are set up." Lizard ignored the pain in his leg as he continued teleporting around and pressing the speed demon worshippers back as they tried to advance toward the shield. "Felix," muttered Lizard in anger. He teleported away and pulled out a flash grenade. After applying a piece of tape to the side and pulling the pin, he appeared right next to Felix and came at him. Felix withdrew, and while he was turned away, Lizard taped the flash grenade to Felix's cloak. "I still know your weakness, Felix," said Lizard. To his surprise, Felix had already removed the grenade and rushed out to the edge of the crater to throw it. "What?" said Lizard. Felix sped back toward Lizard to attack. Lizard teleported in a different direction and attacked a group of lesser speed demon worshippers. "You might be surprised how helpful it is to have someone that can predict everything," said Felix with a smile. Lizard clenched his fists as he continued teleporting around and striking demon worshippers. "It's not possible to predict everything," said Lizard. He thought back to how confident Felix had been before they had traveled to the Golden Age. "Maybe that's true," said Felix, "but our demon prophetess predicted that we might find the Council of Nine in this crater. She predicted that most of you would be weary, injured, and vulnerable. She predicted that you would tape that grenade to me, and she predicted this." Suddenly, Felix disappeared. Lizard looked around as he continued teleporting and fighting. Suddenly he was caught off guard by a huge fireball from David Sawyer and thrown into a heap of demon worshippers. He teleported away in desperation, but found himself right in front of Felix. Before he could react, Felix's lightning-quick punch hit Lizard across the face. Lizard teleported under the shield. "Are you okay?" asked Lucas as he came toward him. "Just a little scratch," said Lizard as he struggled to get up. "Victor," shouted Lucas, "I know you're focused, but can we get your help for a moment?" Victor ran over and placed a hand on Lizard's head. Lizard winced in pain as his injuries closed up. After a minute, the pain was gone. "Be careful," said Victor through heavy breathing. Lizard nodded and teleported out again. Victor turned back to Jennifer. The wound on her abdomen had closed, but she had not gained consciousness. Her breathing had stabilized, and she looked very peaceful. If it had not been for the light and sound of exploding fireballs against the golden dome that Sig maintained with his key, Victor might have believed he was back in the van they had stolen from the airport, watching her sleep and planning a surprise trip to Philip's Italian restaurant. The orange and yellow flames gave a glow to her fair skin. Victor ran his fingers through her shining hair. He smiled in spite of himself. He was suddenly distracted by Lucas's voice. "Who's up on the ridge?" shouted Lucas. "She's back," said Row 82 as his eyes glowed. "Who?" asked Sig in shock. "Who's here?" shouted Jonathan as he turned to look Stephanie in the eye. "What do you mean, it's happening?" he asked again. Suddenly a large number of demon worshippers began running away. "What's happening?" shouted Kirana. "It's Sarah Hawkins!" shouted Felix. "She's leaving!" "What's going on?" shouted David Sawyer. Catherine Page suddenly felt vulnerable and rushed over near David Sawyer. "The demon prophetess has abandoned us," said Catherine in disbelief. "Why would she do that in the moment of our triumph over the Council of Nine?" barked David. Suddenly Felix lied and his men rushed over to David Sawyer. "What shall we do, Felix?" asked Catherine. He had a glazed look in his eyes, as though he could not hear the question. A moment later, Felix's men grabbed Catherine and David and rushed them to the edge of the crater, where the new army had appeared. David was about to unleash a fireball, but he suddenly stopped as he saw the figures to whom they were heading. "Fine?" shouted David. Of course, William Fine was incapable of providing a response. He did the one thing he was still capable of doing. A moment later, Felix's men put Catherine and David down. They and their armies had just been acquired by Zeta 28 and her puppeteer. In a moment, a synchronized barrage of fireballs headed for Jonathan. Kirana was able to leap up and throw several of them back, but as she landed, half a dozen more exploded all around them on the ground. Both Kirana and Jonathan were tossed into the air and knocked hard against the ground. Though they both strained to stay conscious, exhaustion and pain won, and their eyes closed. If Stephanie had been able to scream, she would have. She had somehow evaded the force of the explosions and continued slashing against the armies of skeletal demon worshippers, rushing to finish them off. Lizard was having a far more difficult time fighting off Felix's men and the super soldiers. There were so many of them. Still, He continued to teleport around, striking them repeatedly back and ignoring his own mounting exhaustion. Stephanie already knew that he would not be able to help her. She also knew that she could not hold off the enemies from killing Kirana and Jonathan for much longer. "Need a hand?" came a voice from behind her. It was Lucas. He fired a few rounds with his shotgun and then picked up Jonathan's sword. His eyes began glowing brightly. "You know, one of the things I studied in the past was swordsmanship. Knowing the origin of all the techniques proved quite helpful." Lucas immediately backed up his claim by swirling and slicing efficiently through the swarms of enemies that pressed against them. "Row 82, shouted Lucas. "Get them back to the shield." Row 82's eyes glowed as he rushed and scooped up Jonathan and Kirana, slinging them over his shoulders. "Stephanie Mason," said Row 82, "you must come too." The augment's words reminded her of her own exhaustion, and she reluctantly followed as they rushed back to the dome with Sig, Victor, and Jennifer. After a short time, Lucas joined them, leaving only Lizard outside the protection of Sig's heavenly shield. "Victor, we need Jonathan to attack the mind of William Fine," said Row 82. Victor rushed over and helped heal the cuts and bruises on his body. "He's not waking up," said Row 82 impatiently. "He's exhausted," said Victor. "His body is healed, but it still needs rest. It will likely be the same with Kirana. I hate to say this, but Sig needs some rest too," whispered Lucas. They turned and watched Sig holding up his hands. Sweat had beaded up on his forehead, and he was breathing heavily. Huge numbers of fireballs were pelting the shield, and Sig was obviously growing weary. A few moments later, Lizard appeared in the dome and lost consciousness. They were now all dependent on Sig's ability to fight his exhaustion. "I'm sorry," said Victor. "I don't know what to do." "Jennifer Cedar will die if you cannot figure it out," said Row 82 coldly. Stephanie narrowed her eyes as Victor turned back to Jennifer and knelt beside her. "What should I do?" he whispered. "I can't defeat this army, and I can't heal those who can." A tear ran down his cheek as he saw his weary teammates. "I'm sorry, everyone. I'm sorry that I exhausted everyone." Stephanie suddenly rushed up to Victor and slapped him across the face. The others gasped in shock at her abrupt reaction. Stephanie knelt in the dirt and wrote with her finger, "Use it." "Use what?" asked Victor. "What are you saying?" Lucas asked Stephanie. Stephanie shrugged and wrote, "I thought that would help." Victor scratched his head in confusion. Why would she have thought that would help? She was being as cryptic as Michael had been when he had been in Phillips with Jennifer. Suddenly it occurred to Victor that Michael had probably told her to relay that message to him. His own conversation with Michael had implied that Jennifer would need to be with him, and now she was. He needed to discover what he should do. He knelt down by Jennifer and tried to see if she had brought something or had some weapon in her pockets. It seemed the only thing she had was the mirrored key on the chain about her neck. "Use it." The words came to his mind as soon as he looked at the key. He shook his head. That was preposterous. He was the bearer of the Heaven's Breath key. "Use it." He turned back and looked at Sig. He was squinting his eyes as if shutting out other input to focus on his task. Victor turned back and looked at the key. He realized that if they could use it, they could time travel to safety together. No other key provided that sort of escape. Perhaps Michael had been referring to the time key. Use it. It almost seemed as though the key were saying the words. He remembered feeling a similar calling from the Heaven's Breath key on the cave floors after being injured by Daniel Young. He reluctantly reached out and touched the time key. As his finger touched its mirrored surface, it began glowing brightly. Though he could not see it, this reaction instilled tremendous shock and awe in the faces of his conscious comrades. He grabbed the key more confidently, and his eyes began glowing. Focus on a time. Victor closed his eyes and tried to decide to what time he wanted to travel. He had seen the Golden Age, and things had not been as golden as he had imagined. Though his eyes were closed, Jennifer's face came to his mind. He suddenly knew what he wanted to see. He wanted to see her time. Zeta 28 smiled as she watched the golden shield surrounding the divine key-bearers flicker away. Suddenly there was a blinding flash of light. When her eyes adjusted again, she noticed they had disappeared. She frowned for a moment, but then decided that the loss was minor. The Council of Nine had provided the perfect opportunity to reclaim most of the other demon keys. There was only one that remained. "Come, William," said Zeta 28. "It is time to reclaim the last key and revive the Master. I calculate that we are very near the end of time."